I sometimes wonder whether as Christians we're uncomfortable in sitting in the sorrow and sitting in grief. Over 40% of the Psalms are lament. There's an entire book called Lamentations, and yet we still will avoid it and say, oh, but we've got to have faith and hope and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, sure, fine. But can we walk where the Spirit of God would walk, through a valley of dry bones too? Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Our heart sickness can sometimes leave us feeling like nothing is ever going to change. I've tried, I've used those gifts before and I failed, or I told somebody and they laughed at me, or all these sorts of things. It's okay to be disappointed, and it's okay to grieve. I often think sometimes we try and handle these things by saying, right, well, that's wrong and this is right. And I'm like, that may be true, but grief is real. You may need to grieve the frustration and the confusion and the disappointment of trying and failing. And I think when we're tired, we can often just feel the weight of how we used to try. Since you're not earning your way to God's approval, and since you're already loved, and since you're already thought highly of, I would say you don't have to try, and you don't have to prove, and you don't have to defend yourself, and you don't even have to show enthusiasm. It's not like he doesn't know. He's all good with that. I think the key thing is just come and talk about your own disappointment. You know, it reminds me of Ezekiel 37. The first couple of verses of that chapter tell the story of the Spirit of God walking Ezekiel through a valley of dry bones. And it's really interesting because in the language it shows that it's the Spirit of God that makes him do it. And when you think of the history of that time, his people have lost everything. They've fallen under a stronger power who had some really macabre, I mean, war is always macabre, but really difficult. Like, they'd leave the bodies out and they'd be picked out by the animals. And that was a practice for their oppressor at that time. When the city was under siege, people who didn't die by the sword died by famine, died by disease. Do you know what I mean? It was just awful. When you look back at Ezekiel's story, you see he loses his wife in some era and he doesn't mourn. And so whenever I see the Spirit of God making him walk through these valley of dry bones, I'm like, these are his people. This is his story. This is his hope. And it's all gone. And in the Hebrew, the language is the idiom and the rhythm of lament. I think even recognizing that God took him there and walked with him there, and it's this thing about bones that are very dry, which is this picture of being at the end of the end of the end of yourself. It was just even helpful to know that God was doing the walking with him, that God was in the middle of grief and agony and sorrow and stirring and regret and the if-onlys and all of these things. And he's not waiting for us to come out all like, okay, I had my time and now I'm good with you. Do you know what I mean? That's not how this works. God asking Ezekiel a question he clearly knows the answer to, can these bones live? It speaks to us something of how you walk through disappointment and heart sickness and sorrow, how you walk through failures and the tries that didn't get anywhere. Because Ezekiel did all the right things and it was still a mess. It was still a mess, and it was still hard and difficult, and he wasn't going to get his wife back. Do you know what I mean? It was all these terrible things. He walks with them in the grief, and he walks with them in the sorrow, and he leads them through this journey, and then he says, speak to these bones. And you see this journey of the Spirit of God bringing these people back to life again, and a promise of hope. And I think if you are feeling that this is never going to change, maybe it's not time to change yet. Maybe it's time to grieve first.